Okay, so moving on, let's talk about factorial designs. So when you're running an experiment, sometimes you have more than one independent variable. So rather than just manipulating a single thing, you might want to manipulate multiple things. So for example, I could test whether neutral or negative words are easier to remember. But I might want to also test whether imagining those words or visualizing them produces different effects than just rehearsing them. And while I could test those separately, I might want to test them together in a factorial design, meaning I'm going to manipulate both within the same experiment. So before we get into that, let's look at this example in a bit more depth, and you can see what this looks like. So this is just a hypothetical. We would have more trials and more words and a bunch of other stuff if this was real, but it's just an example to get the point across. So if we wanted to test those two things, word type being neutral versus negative, and also wanted to test uh, strategy of either rehearsing it or imagining it, this is what that would look like. First, they would see a list of words and then try to remember as many as they can by repeating them in your head. So first, they're going to do that for neutral words, and then they write down as many as they can. That's the first condition. Then they're going to do another list of words, study it for 30 seconds, and try to remember as many as they can by visualizing them. And it's going to be, again, neutral words. Write them all down. Then they're going to see another list, try to remember as many as they can by repeating them in their head, but they're going to be negative words. Write them down. And then they're going to see another list of words, try to remember as many as they can by visualizing each word. And now these are again going to be negative words. Write them all down. So that's what it's going to look like. That's an example of a factorial design where you have more than one independent variable. When you only have one independent variable, it's going to be a single factor design. Multiple independent variables, multiple things you manipulate, is going to be factorial. So what we just did, that example, was what's called a 2 by 2 factorial design. And what this means is that we have two independent variables, and each independent variable has two levels. Okay. So keep in mind that, and try to be clear on this, having more than two levels is not a factorial design. Having more than one independent variable is what makes a factorial design. Remember, each independent variable has to have two or more levels, two or more conditions, right? Well, the same thing goes for when you have multiple independent variables. So you can have two or, in a single factor design, you have one independent variable with two or more levels, two or more conditions. In a factorial design, you're going to have at least two independent variables, each with at least two levels. So that's what this part means. That's what this notation here means. It means that 2 by 2, as in we have two independent variables, and we'll look at other examples as we go through this, and those independent variables each have two levels. That's what the twos mean. The fact that there are two different numbers here means there's two independent variables. Again, we'll look at more examples. Now, when you have a factorial design, the way it works is you're going to have every possible combination of the two, or sorry, of the independent variables, however many you have and however many levels they have. So if you think about it, if we have two levels from two independent variables to choose from, this just means that we're going to have four different conditions. Right? Because each condition is going to be a combination of the different levels of the different independent variables. Okay. So here's what that looked like in our example. We had, remember, two independent variables with two levels each. So one was memory strategy, whether you're rehearsing it or trying to visualize it. The other being word type, neutral versus negative words. So again, we're going to have all the combinations of those levels. So we're going to have one condition. We had a slightly different order, but that doesn't really matter. One condition where it was rehearsal for neutral words, one where it was rehearsal for negative words, one where it was imagery for neutral words, and then one where it was imagery for negative words. Again, don't worry about the order too much. The point is again, we're just going to have each combination we can do. That's again what we mean by, since it's a 2x2 design, that's going to give us four conditions because there's four combinations here. Okay. A great way to think about this is to actually draw a little box like this and plot your independent variables and then kind of draw out what the conditions will look like. So let's do that for now. Don't look at these answers just yet, or at least try not to. So if we have two conditions of the memory strategy, let's put those up here. There's memory strategy of rehearsal. There's the memory strategy of imagery. Okay. Here's the word type variable, and we're going to have neutral words being one condition and negative words being the other condition. We'll plot each level of above or next to each other on, and each independent variable is going to go on one side of the box. So again, we got our two levels of memory strategy here, our two levels of word type here. Now you can, all you have to do is just cross those variables. So this cell here, this is going to be, well, what's it pointing to? Neutral words, that's what it's next to, and rehearsal. So we're going to have rehearsal of neutral words here. Down here, it's going to be still in the rehearsal strategy, but it's in the negative words column. It's going to be rehearsal of negative words. Over here, we're going to have the imagery, remember visualizing the words, in that column. I think I said column before, I meant to say row, but here we have the imagery column and the neutral word row. So crossing these two, we're going to get imagery for neutral words. And then lastly, we're going to do imagery column with the negative words row, meaning imagery for negative words. This is a really good way to draw out a factorial design, and it'll help you kind of understand how we do the different combinations. Because again, we want every combination we can do. Excuse me. Okay. All right. So that was a 2x2 design. How about a 3x2 design? Well, let's just take a minute, or you can take a minute and just look at this and try and unpack what this is going to mean. So think about how many independent variables are there and how many levels do those independent variables have? And then lastly, how many conditions are we going to have? Well, first of all, You could pause it if you want, try to think about that, but I'll move on now. First of all, our independent variable, we're going to have two independent variables here. One here and one here. So two independent variables. So in other words, the number of numbers here, that's going to be how many independent variables we have. So 3 and 2, that means two different numbers, or they don't have to be different rather, but two numbers, that's going to give us two independent variables. Right? How about the number of conditions though? Or sorry, let's start with the number of levels. So if we have two independent variables, but how many levels do those variables have? Well, this first one has 3, the other one has 2. That's what the numbers themselves mean. This independent variable has 3 levels, this one has 2. Simple as that. Okay. And then lastly, how do we get the number of conditions? Well, all we have to do is multiply these numbers. 3 by 2 is going to give us obviously 6, meaning we have 6 different conditions. Okay. So again, to summarize, we have two independent variables here because of these two numbers. We have the first variable has 3 levels, meaning 3 conditions. The other one has 2. And 3 times 2 is 6. That means 6 different conditions. So let's look at a more practical example. Let's say we wanted to look at memory strategy, rehearsal versus imagery, but we wanted to add a third level to that independent variable. So we still have 2 independent variables, but one now has 3 levels instead of 2. Meaning we have rehearsal, let's say imagery versus elaboration. So elaboration, well, I won't go off on a tangent here, but the problem with elaboration is that it's not really well defined in memory research. That's why people don't like it. But let's say it's just telling the people to connect it to something in their lives. So think of a time this word related to you. That'll be our elaboration condition. So, okay, again, preconditions, 2 independent variables. Neutral versus negative words, rehearsal versus imagery versus elaboration. So what, kind of working in reverse here, what would be the numbers we're going to put in here? One thing I'd recommend trying, pause the video and make yourself a box like we talked about. So put the 3 levels on, say, above, and then the 2 levels to the side, and then draw out the combinations. You can resume the video, just pause the video and resume it when you're finished with that. This would give us a 3 by 2 design. Because again, we have, well, obviously 2 independent variables, so one here. And we're going to have 3 levels to the first variable, 3 conditions, rehearsal versus imagery versus elaboration, times 2, neutral versus negative words. Okay. And then the easiest part, even if you don't draw it out, just means that 3 times 2 is going to be 6. So 6 conditions, like the last example. Here's a drawing out that I was talking about. So again, our different conditions are going to go in a box here, in each of these boxes here, and then same here for the other independent variable. So again, rehearsal is going to cross with neutral. Rehearsal for neutral words, that's one condition. Imagery for neutral words, that's another condition. Elaboration for neutral words. Rehearsal for negative words. Rehearsal for oh, sorry, that's just a typo. This should be imagery for negative words. And then elaboration for negative words. Again, just crossing these 2 factors into the 6 possible conditions. Right? And again, this is what that looks like. Otherwise, rehearsal, well, we kind of already covered this, but rehearsal for neutral words, rehearsal for negative words, imagery for neutral words, imagery for negative words, elaboration for neutral, and elaboration for negative. Because we're doing every possible combination. Okay. Now, you can, like I mentioned before, you can have more than two independent variables. It's not as common, but it is done. So something known as a higher order factorial design, that would be when you have three independent variables or more. And again, it's not three levels of one independent variable, but it's going to be three independent variables. Okay? So since we have three different numbers here, that means we have three independent variables. How many levels do each of those independent variables have? Two each, right? Because that's the actual numbers themselves. And of course, how many groups do we have? Well, it's the same logic again. This is just going to be multiplying the numbers. So we would have 8 conditions. 2 times 2 times 2. It's the same as if you just had two independent variables. You're going to just multiply the numbers and run every possible combination. So what's an example of that? Well, let's say I wanted to run a memory test and I wanted to compare rehearsal versus imagery like we did before. And I wanted to also manipulate the familiarity of the words. So use, say, more British words versus more American words. And then lastly, I also wanted to manipulate the type of word being about sports or being about food. Okay. We got obviously three independent variables here. Each has two levels: rehearsal versus imagery, British versus American, sports versus food. So just try to be clear and feel free to send me an email if you're unclear whether we're talking about the number of independent variables, meaning the number of things you manipulate, versus the number of conditions you have for each independent variable. We have three independent variables here, and each has two conditions. Okay, here's what that looks like. Again, you can use this little box thing. So we're going to have two, of course, because we'd have to do 3 dimensions with a three-way design, but we're going to have rehearsal for American words and for foods. That's going to be our first condition. We're going to have imagery for American words, and it's going to be foods. All this stuff up here is foods. All this stuff down here is sports. Other than that, it's really just the same as if it's a two independent variables. So here we're going to have rehearsal, and then British words, and still sticking with foods. We have rehearsal, or sorry, it should be imagery for British words and for foods. Just ignore that rehearsal word. Those are 4 of our conditions. And then we're just going to do the same thing for sports, right? So rehearsal for American words, sports, imagery, again, ignore this little typo here. Imagery for American words and sports, imagery for British words and sports, and then rehearsal for British words and sports. Okay? And there's our 8 conditions. 8 different combinations of our different independent variables, or levels, I guess you could say. Here's what that looks like. So you kind of saw this already, but again, rehearsal for American words and foods, rehearsal for American words and sports, rehearsal for British words and foods, rehearsal for British words and sports, imagery for American words and foods, imagery for American words and sports, imagery for British words and foods, imagery for British words and sports. So again, all the different combinations, which you can get just by drawing it out like this. Okay. Now, something you might be wondering about is how does this work within subjects versus between subjects designs or matched designs as well? Well, it turns out you can have factorial designs that are entirely between subjects, entirely within subjects, or what's known as a mixed design, or any of those with a matched group design. Okay, so for example, let's go back to an earlier one. I could manipulate one of these factors. Well, let's start with purely within subjects design, which is really what we did here. So in this example, I'm just going to have every participant do every condition. So everyone's going to do this, everyone's going to do this, everyone's going to do this, and everyone's going to do this. Okay. That would mean, again, that both variables are being manipulated within subjects. Memory strategy is manipulated within subjects. Word type is manipulated within subjects. Okay. Another possibility is that I could run it entirely between subjects, which would be simply that I have 4 different groups of people, each do one condition. So let's say 10 people do this, 10 people do that, 10 people do this, and 10 people do that. Simple. And then lastly, and again, I won't really talk about match designs here, but it's the same logic. So I could have, say, match people doing all 4 conditions, basically. So 10 close, you wouldn't do this for a memory experiment, but say 10 people matched with, or let's say, that's not a great example. Yeah, I could have 10 people matched with 10 people here, 10 people here, and 10 people here, and then each of them do their respective condition. However, we can also have what's called a mixed design, and this applies to repeated measures as well as matched designs. This is where you manipulate one factor within subjects, and one factor gets manipulated between subjects. So what that's going to look like is I'm going to have, say, 10 people do this. I'm going to have basically manipulate one variable within subjects. Let's say that's memory strategy, but manipulate the other between subjects. Okay. So what that's going to look like is I'm going to have, let's say 10 people do this condition and this condition. So it's the same people doing both of these conditions. However, I'm going to have a different 10 people do this condition and this condition. Okay. So 10 people, 10 of the same people doing both of these, and then 10 of the same people doing both of these. That would mean that one variable is being manipulated within subject, that being memory strategy, because the same people are doing rehearsal versus imagery for neutral words, and then the same people are doing rehearsal versus imagery for negative words. That's a within subjects factor. However, the between subjects factor is word type. So different people are doing negative words, but the same people are doing rehearsal versus image. Okay. I don't think there's much on that, but that's a good thing to be aware of, that you can manipulate one factor or both factors, or if you have 2 factors or 3 factors or 1 factor between, within, or using a match design. It always, as always, just depends on your research question. You might have reason to do one thing within subjects and one thing between, or it might be easiest to just do everything within, or it might be best to just do everything between. Again, just depends on your research question and all the stuff we talked about. Like, doesn't matter if people know know what you're doing. Will they be able to figure out what you're doing? Stuff like that. Okay. All right. So why though might you want to run some sort of factorial design? Well, we're not going to get into this too much, but sometimes you want to look at, well, sometimes it's just more efficient. That can be a reason. But more often it's the case that you're looking at what's known as an interaction, or you want to know, do the two variables kind of work together in some way? So we won't go into this too much, at least not now, but sometimes what happens is that the effect of one independent variable depends on another independent variable. So just for example, and there's not really reason to suspect this, but just hypothetically, we could find that there's a difference. The effect of one variable depends on another independent variable. So for example, maybe imagery is better than rehearsal for neutral words, but it's the opposite for negative words. For negative words, rehearsal is better. That would be what's known as an interaction, because it's no longer the case that imagery is just better or worse. It depends on the word type. Okay? Another example might be, let's say negative words are easier to remember, but only if you're using imagery. So if comparing these two, there's a difference, but there's no difference between these two. That would be an interaction. It just means that one independent variable, the effect is not straightforward and it depends on the other independent variable or variables if you have a three-way. But like I said, we won't really get into that now, but that's just to give you an example of why you might want to use more than one independent variables rather than just doing separate experiments. If you're interested in how do those two independent variables interact? Okay, just a review question. Matching is designed to control which of the following sources of extraneous variability? Variable environmental conditions over the course of the study, individual differences among participants, fluctuations in the physical mental state of an individual participant. There's going to be individual differences because we're kind of matching people based on some characteristic, some individual difference, like say their baseline strength that we talked about, or their baseline memory, and we can kind of equate that across conditions. Okay, that's it for this week. And and I just want to say again, feel free to send me an email if you're unclear on any of this stuff. I know we don't really get a chance to ask questions with these online lectures. So again, send me an email if you're unclear on something.